हेलो।
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, and we'll be starting in just 3 minutes. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Almuth Ernsting of Biofuelwatch, who will be presenting this webinar. If you have any questions, then please type them into the chat box to the right of your screen. If for any reason the chat feature doesn't work for you, then you can also email your question to biofuelwatch@gmail.com. The webinar will be a maximum of 1 hour long, depending on how many questions there are. So, Almuth, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So today Biofuelwatch published our report about aviation biofuels. The report has been published a few days ahead of a high-level conference convened by ICAO in Mexico City, which will take place from the 11th to the 13th of October, and which is all about aviation biofuels, or as a title, as they're called, alternative fuels, but de facto biofuels. So in this presentation and in the report, I'm looking at what this really means and what the developments, what type of biofuels are available for aircraft, and what is a major scale-up of such biofuels likely to mean. Next slide, please. The big question that the report seeks to answer is whether large-scale aviation biofuels would depend on palm oil. And in terms of framing this question, I think it's really important to say that we are starting from the assumption that palm oil is a very last form of biofuels that airlines or really anyone in the aviation industry would want to choose if there is a choice. And I don't think I'll have to go into the reasons for that. The large-scale deforestation, peatland destruction, land grabbing, and various other abuses associated with palm oil, I think, are very well known. The question really is it possible to have really large-scale use of biofuels in aircraft on a scale such as is proposed in a proposal to be discussed in Mexico next week? Is it possible to scale up biofuels like that without relying to a very, very large part on palm oil? Next slide. Now, first of all, however, before we get onto that, let's put this into context. Why is there a debate about biofuels for aviation? Why are proposals for scaling them up on a really massive scale being discussed? Well, the reason is really that aviation is one of the fastest, amongst all the sectors, aviation has some of the very fastest rising greenhouse gas emissions. So between 1990 and 2014, emissions rose by about 86%. That's just from international aviation. The Airline Industry Association, IATA, expects that the volume of air travel will double between 2016 and 2036. So, and this will, if this happens, if the growth continues, this will inevitably mean far more CO2 and greenhouse gases being emitted from planes. There are right now no alternatives to burning liquid fuels on the horizon for aircraft. And efficiency improvements, although those are obviously very important, there's no way that they can they can be on the same scale as the industry is growing at the moment. And really, this emissions growth it's quite obvious, is completely incompatible with the aim of keeping temperatures to within 1.5 or even 2 degrees, which is the aim of the Paris Agreement signed by countries last year. Next slide, please. So what we are seeing is really the issue that the ongoing growth of the industry is incompatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Under the Kyoto Agreement, the industry has been, certainly international aviation has been exempt from any curbs on emissions. But there's a real concern that that certainly the industry needs to be seen to be doing something now. Otherwise, any genuine curbs on flying would obviously have a huge impact on their profits and shareholder profits. And here is, so hence there's been talk about, for actually quite some years by the industry, and now adopted by ICAO, which is a adopted a while back by ICAO, which is a specialist UN organization, which is the concept of carbon neutral growth from 2020. And this here really shows what this would mean. You have in the red and white stripes, you have the emissions that would be unregulated, which is really all the emissions up to 2020. That level of emissions, it wouldn't come down, but after that, you still have this really fast growth. And if you look at the dark blue ones, and there's the two darkest blue ones. The two at the top are what they hope to get through efficiency improvements, fuel efficiency and operational efficiency improvements. And all the light blue is what they need to cover. And the idea is to do that mainly with offsets and with biofuels. And the latter is what this presentation is about. Next, please. Now, so before the ICAO delegates next week will be a proposal by ICAO Secretariat to adopt a vision which would see the use of biofuels scaled up from very, very little to 32% of all jet fuel use by 2040 and 50% by 2050. So now, next to that, in the yellow, the furthest on the right, you can see the volume of the total global biofuels production in 2016. So they want to see more biofuels burned in planes well before 2040 every year than is produced for all sectors currently. And they want to really, they're encouraging the member states to put support measures into place to make this happen. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit here, you can see, where we are now with biofuel production. Yes, there have been over 2,000 flights which have used some biofuels and biofuel blends in the tank so far. But this is a kind of estimate by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, where you can see on the left the volume of total jet fuel used today, and then this tiny minute slither on the right is the refinery capacity which Bloomberg New Energy Finance believes could be used to produce aviation biofuels today. In my estimate, that's even that tiny slither is an overestimate. Right now, there's only one refinery operated by Almuth Ernsting in California, which regularly produces biofuels for aircraft, and it produced less than 45,000 tons of those biofuels in 2016. It mainly produces fuels for road transport. Next, please. Now, before I get into what type of fuels will be used, I think it's really worth remembering that wherever biofuels are used, the basic problem with biofuels is that you need a huge amount of biomass and thereby a huge amount of land to meet a very, very small proportion, or to replace a very small proportion of fossil fuels. So right now, all the impacts that we're all aware of that have been happening, maybe very dramatic impacts of biofuel markets and biofuel demand, they only account for 4% of global road transport fuels. And here on the left, you can see from a study called Energy Sprawl, Energy Efficiency, an estimate of the land footprint of different types of energy. That's nothing to do with aviation. It's really overall, which shows, right at the top, bioenergy, really biomass for electricity and biofuels for transport, having by far the biggest land footprint. So that means really any type of large-scale biofuels is going to have a massive land footprint, no matter where it comes from. Next slide, please. And really, yeah. So now, what's approved for aviation? So first of all, you cannot use, so at the moment, 95% of biofuels produced worldwide are either ethanol or biodiesel, and you cannot use them in planes in no amount of those in planes. That they are not safe. It's not safe to fly with them in the tank. However, in recent years, there have been 5 types of biofuels based on 4 different technologies approved for commercial use in passenger aircraft. And in the report, we're discussing them in quite a lot of detail, so please go to that to find out more. But very briefly, there are 2 of them that involve fermenting sugars, whether they come from sugar crops or from cereals or from potentially from lignocellulosic material biomass. So fermenting sugars to hydrocarbon fuels, i.e. the type of fuels that can be used in aviation. Both of those require genetically engineered microorganisms for fermentation. Then there are biofuels have been approved that are would be made by gasifying biomass, which means exposing it to high temperatures with controlled and limited oxygen, and then reforming that, what's called a syngas, to a liquid fuel using a technology called Fischer-Tropsch. I'll get to that in a bit. And then the last one, although not the last one to be approved, the last on my list, are biofuels made based on hydrotreating of vegetable oils and animal fats. Again, I'll say more about that in a bit. Next slide, please. So first of the sugar fermentation ones, the company that invented that is called Amyris. Amyris uses genetically engineered yeast. They have a refinery in Brazil, where they are using they're using sugarcane as a feedstock, and they are converting the sugars to a product called farnesene, which can then be upgraded to aviation fuels. Some of Amyris's fuels have been used in aircraft before. The problem is the cost of the whole process and the difficulty and the efficiency of doing it. In 2011, Amyris's directors said that they were hoping to be able to, at least for some years, be able to sell the farnesene at the actual production cost, which was at the minimum $3,180 per barrel. So, you know, you're speaking of really astronomical cost, production cost, where it pretty much doesn't matter whether the price of oil is at $100 or $40 or whatever. It's one way or other, it's totally astronomical. So for the time that they produced biofuels, their problem was that the more biofuels they sold, the greater their losses were. So the more they sold, the more they were in the red. Amyris has now quite officially given up, for the time being at least, given up on making biofuels. They focus on making skincare emollients and personal care products, using small quantities of the farnesene for high-value products. And no other company has taken up this particular method for jet fuel. Next, please. The next one is by a company called Gevo. It's quite relatively similar. They're using a bacterium rather than yeast, and they are fermenting cornstarch. They had a very high profile flight by Alaska Airlines, where they used lignocellulosic sugars. But again, they've got the very same problem. Every barrel of this either isobutanol that they need for jet fuel is produced at a really big loss to the company. So much so that even though 3 of their 4 fermentation tanks are for straightforward corn ethanol, the whole business is still running at a loss, and they're saying we do not expect to achieve profitability in the foreseeable future, and we may never achieve it. So they are long way. Those processes are a long way off commercially viable production. Next, please. So I just rushed through that very, very briefly. The fact that this isn't likely to happen, this certainly won't be happening on a large scale in terms of commercial biofuel production, doesn't mean it's safe. And there are really, really serious concerns over the use of genetically engineered microorganisms inside industrial refinery, especially inside industrial refinery environments where they really cannot be safely contained. And I think one thing we picked up was that Gevo, for example, said one of the big problems, they can't produce their jet fuel in an inefficient way, is that they can't keep other types of non-GE yeast out of the tanks, in which case I'm asking myself, if they can't stop contamination of their GE yeast, how can they stop it from for the GE yeast in turn from escaping out of that environment? Again, let's discuss in more detail in the report. Next, please. Yeah, then the third one on my list is Fischer-Tropsch gasification. This is a very old technology. It's been developed at least since the 1940s. Fischer-Tropsch reforming is something that has been done quite successfully in relation, not cheaply, but technically successfully, unfortunately, with coal. It was really commercialized by the apartheid regime in South Africa. Sasol, who still make most of the Fischer-Tropsch fuel produced today, but making it from biomass rather is not the same as making it from coal. There have been lots and lots of attempts to produce the so-called synfuels from biomass. None of them has been commercially successful. Nobody, not from waste, not from biomass. There are problems with the gasification type of it, but as for Fischer-Tropsch on its own, it just hasn't been successful. And right now, there's virtually hardly any credible demonstration or research projects still going on as far as that is concerned. So, really serious doubt. It's certainly not something that's viable with the present state of technology. Next, please. However, there is one type of aviation fuel which can be produced. There are no technical hurdles to it, and that's hydrotreated vegetable oils and animal fats. But in short, the term is HVO. There's another term you often see it called HEFA or HEFA for aviation fuel. Let's stick to HVO here now. HVO fuels, they are currently account for 4% of all biofuel production, almost all of them produced for cars at the moment, but they are growing at more than 10 times the rate of biofuels overall. The biggest producer, 60% of all HVOs produced by Neste, a Finnish oil and increasingly biofuel company. It's mainly done to produce most of the fuels HVO diesel in cars, but it's technically very easy to make HVO jet fuel, albeit currently more expensive than HVO diesel. Next, please. So right now, HVO jet fuel is technically very feasible, but it's more expensive. It's pretty expensive. It's really way too expensive for airlines to adopt on a larger scale. That one refinery I mentioned open that made those 45,000 tons of jet fuel. That is HVO jet fuel, but yeah, it's costly. However, the real concern for us is the fact that Boeing and Neste have jointly applied to allow up to 15% of HVO diesel. Sorry, there should be HVO diesel blends with conventional jet fuels. If that is approved, because HVO diesel is much cheaper, then that would dramatically reduce the cost of aviation biofuels. And 15% of current jet fuel demand, yes, it's much lower than what the ICAO Secretariat wants to see by 2040, but it's already equivalent to 3 times the entire volume of the European Union's biofuel market. So it's potentially a massive new market, HVO diesel. Next, please. So the big problem with HVO now is not, yes, on a small scale, actually the cheapest feedstock for HVO is tallow, followed by used cooking oil. But those are really only available in very, very limited, very fixed quantities. There's only so much ship fat oil that you can possibly get. And there's tallow is a byproduct of livestock industry. It's in fixed it's not going to increase in response to demand. So if you're looking at large-scale production, by far the cheapest feedstock is palm oil, and this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization, where you've got the red is a palm oil price over last couple of years, and you can extend that back many other years. It's almost always the same, and then you've got other types of vegetable oils. Palm oil, on the whole, always comes in very much cheaper. And on top of that, if you make HVO fuel, so HVO refining is itself relatively expensive, and it is cheap. The actual physical refining is cheaper for palm oil than it is for rapeseed, soybean, or for that matter, camelina oil. So the economics very heavily favor palm oil in a way that far more so than is the case for biodiesel, where the refining, where actually other types of vegetable oils are actually more suitable. For HVO, palm oil happens to be particularly suitable technically. Next, please. So, not surprisingly, the world's HVO production relies very heavily on palm oil. We've got Eni, Cepsa, Galp, Repsol, BP, and 2 Chinese producers all use palm oil in the HVO. Total plans to do so. It's converting a big oil refinery in France that will mainly use palm oil. And Neste, the biggest producer, does use palm oil. It says that it uses mainly waste and residues. But wait, next slide. The trouble is that their waste and residues contain a lot of a fraction of crude palm oil, which is called palm fatty acid distillate, PFAD. It sounds very, very technical, but it's basically a part of crude palm oil that isn't used in food-grade palm oil, but that is in very high demand by a lot of different industries. None of that would ever be wasted. It's really high-value product in itself. Next, please. And the problem is that if Neste Oil and other companies are pushing for PFAD to be classified as a residue, what that means is that it wouldn't be declared as palm oil, and it would really be a way to introduce potentially very significant amounts of palm oil into the fuel chain without it being called palm oil, just under the name of residues and waste. And when we asked Neste what the proportion of PFAD in their residues and waste is, they told us that that was commercially confidential. They will not disclose it. Next, please. Now, does that mean that planes we can definitely expect massive use of palm oil in the tanks of planes in the near future? Well, I think that depends entirely on decisions made by policymakers. Even palm oil HVO diesel, which would be the cheapest type of feasible aviation biofuel, is still more expensive than jet fuel. But so it really depends on whether policymakers decide to subsidize it or extend existing biofuel road transport subsidies to the aviation sector, be it so mandatory quotas, tax rebate exemptions, etc., tax exemptions, and other type of subsidy measures. We think that it was because there are no credible alternatives to palm oil in aviation biofuels, that setting targets and subsidizing the industry, incentivizing a real growth in biofuel use in that sector will inevitably lead to large-scale palm oil use. Next, please. And we are also quite concerned that the mere hype about that would be triggered by if ICAO was to adopt a vision of large-scale biofuel use. There is a real danger that the mere hype in itself would directly lead to more land grabbing and more deforestation, more expansion by oil palm companies, even if that demand did not necessarily materialize, or not to that extent. And the example for that is, or actually the worst example I can possibly think of, is that ActionAid found in a study in 2013 that by that time 6 million hectares of land in sub-Saharan Africa had been acquired by European investors for biofuel production. Yet by 2013, virtually no African feedstock was ever used in European EU biofuels. Hardly any African feedstock is used in European biofuels today. So it was entirely the expectation and the hype around biofuel markets that triggered this really massive land grab with really serious consequences for communities and ecosystems in many, many countries. Next, please. Standards, we believe, and cannot be the answers. First of all, standards cannot address the sustainability, or in this case, the unsustainability of demand. There's no way that you can replace a meaningful fraction of current jet fuel use with biofuels without massive, massive demand for land. They cannot address the important indirect impact of biofuels. And there's also no credible and independent system for auditing and enforcing any standards. And finally, if there were any attempts to really promote biofuels from anything except for palm oil, you would certainly be seeing palm oil producing nations challenge that in the World Trade Organizations and possibly through other bilateral, multilateral trade agreements. So, yeah, they are not the solution. Next, please. Or last one, I think. So, yeah, in conclusion, that there's really no technically viable aviation biofuel other than HVO. Scaling that up will require palm oil because that is really because of the economics. And even limited amount of aviation biofuels can lead to further land grabs and deforestation. And even the hype itself generated is really dangerous. And therefore, what we believe is really vital is not to let the fossil fuel use off the hook, and not to let the fossil fuel industry off the hook by that. But the only way to really curb the emissions of the aviation sector, which is absolutely vital if you want to keep temperatures to within 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees or global warming, the only way we can do that is to stop and then to reverse the growth in global aviation, and to put policies in place that will achieve that, such as ending the subsidies like tax breaks, tax exemptions for jet fuel, and shifting support measures, shifting subsidies towards real alternatives, especially in the case of short-haul flights, the main alternative being affordable rail transport. Right, so that's my that's the presentation over. I think, yeah, any questions, please do type them in or email into the live chat, or email them to biofuelwatch@gmail.com, which we're looking at and can answer. Okay, I've got one question here saying, can you say more about the effort to get PFAD classified as a waste and residue? What are the most important regulatory settings for that debate? Well, there are different contexts. I mean, that debate is happening in the context of biofuel policy overall. It's without being party to the ICAO, there are debates about standards for biofuels going on within the ICAO process. I'm not party to those, but I'm pretty certain that the classification of PFAD will feature because of the importance. I certainly know that within the EU, there has been a lot of debate around that. For example, in the UK, is it a residue or not? So the UK, for example, classifies palm fatty acid distillates as a product in exactly the same way as crude palm oil, which I believe is absolutely correct. There were big debates in Norway about that, where it was classified as a waste and residue. It's now classified as a byproduct, still not a product, but still a lot better. And I believe in Italy, it's still classified as a residue, which is, really concerning. So there are debates going on about that in different, in the different really policy contexts. So yeah, what is PF? Went past slide 16, 17 very fast. Please explain PFAD once more. Would it be possible to go back to that one with the diagram, with the refining diagram? Yes, thank you. So what you have is palm oil. Yeah, I mean, you basically, you harvest the crude palm oil, you take it to a palm mill, and then you refine. You have to refine it because for food grade palm oil, you have to use very, very few fatty acids. Having too many fatty acids in palm oil basically makes it go rancid and horrible, and yeah, not very edible. So the fatty acids are removed. That's sort of it's not that clear, I'm afraid, but it's in the I mean, it's a little bit blurry, but basically it's in the top right hand corner where it says the distillate. So they are removed. The distillate residues is removed, and that's a fatty acid, the PFAD, and they are then, in the absence of a biofuel market, they are sold on to make, they can be used for animal feed, they can be used for nutraceuticals, but they're often used to make for all sorts of chemicals, from soap to candle making to use in plastics, yeah, and lots of different oleochemical products. Okay. Right, any more questions? I'll wait a couple of minutes. As we're seeing if there's any more questions, just to say we have uploaded the report on our website today. So it's right now linked to the webinar invitation, which is on our homepage, and right afterwards we'll put it straight onto the homepage by itself. So please do read it in detail. If and we've got or look at the executive summary if you haven't got that much time. Okay, how the EU resolution impacts on the expansion of palm oil for biofuels. What I think the person asking this question probably means is there was a resolution by the European Parliament earlier this year that calls for an end of palm oil use in EU biofuels by 2020 at the latest. Although it's a non-binding resolution, it's one that that is very welcome and does carry political weight. And yeah, one of the big conclusions of the report and the analysis I've done is that that any support for scaling up aviation biofuel use would really be incompatible with the aims of that resolution, because there are no alternatives to palm oil for larger scale biofuels in aviation. It's really a reason why certainly the EU shouldn't support such a market from being created. Okay, next one is, could you tell us more about UCO, i.e. used cooking oil and tallow availability and potential existing users and impacts associated to their displacement? Yeah, I've got some figure. I mean, I've got more figures in the report that I don't all know off by heart, but used cooking oil is it's very much one of the really favorite feedstocks for biodiesel as well, used in road transport. Both of them are tallow as well. Used cooking oil in itself doesn't really, I mean, it's one of the feedstocks, used cooking oil, which is definitely sensible to use as a fuel, but it is clearly in quite limited, in very limited supply. So the concern is that if you create a market, once somebody was to create a market for aviation biofuels, then any used cooking oil used there will simply be taken away from the road transport sector. And as long as we continue to have large-scale biofuel production for cars as well, you'll simply see some displacement. You'll simply see more biofuel producers switching to virgin vegetable oils such as palm oil, rapeseed oil, soybean oil, etc., that need lots and lots of land. For tallow, that is partly also the case, but the issue with tallow is more complicated. There are some types of tallow that are very, very contaminated and quite toxic tallow that can only be used as a fuel and is being widely used in road transport at the moment. But you also have tallow that is much higher grade and that is also in very high demand. In some cases it is even food grade, and in other cases it is used by the same industries that are also using the PFAD, which is the oleochemical industry, soap making, and the animal feed industry. And there are real concerns of displacement. And there was a report published, I think from memory, it's in our report, but from memory it was published by the European Commission, was certainly EU-based, a consultancy report. Not that long ago, that basically shows that depending on the scale of tallow used in biofuels, there is definitely a real risk of indirectly triggering more palm oil expansion, because other current tallow users will almost certainly, in some cases, probably already are switching to palm oil. So it basically, in short, very limited supply, very high existing demand, can't create a new market for it without causing some displacement and overall ending up with somebody somewhere using a lot more virgin vegetable oils. Okay, I'll wait another minute to see if there's any more questions. Okay. Someone says they have emailed. Okay, wait a minute. For some reason, the email, whoever emailed, it's not arrived at biofuelwatch@gmail.com. We're still waiting for it to arrive, sorry. Maybe resend? Okay. Okay, here we have. Okay, what is the ratio of aviation fuels to overall greenhouse gas emissions? I'm afraid I don't have the exact figure in my head. there is, I mean, one really, there are some really good materials available if you go to the Transport Environment website, and their background in aviation fuels. If you search for aviation fuels, that's a good source of information. There are different ways of calculating aviation emissions, and certainly one of the concerns is that the carbon dioxide emissions on their own don't reflect the full global warming impact, but the main concern is that they are one of the very fastest growing sectors today. You know, they're expanding whilst other sectors are under pressure to reduce their emissions. So yeah, I suggest you look at the Transport Environment website for the precise figures. Why is palm oil so cheap, and even cheaper than fossil fuels? Well, I haven't said that palm oil HVO is not cheaper than fossil fuels, certainly once it's refined. I mean, palm oil is the cheapest of the vegetable oils because it's grown in the tropics, where, you know, in humid, warm environments where photosynthesis, you know, at maximum, you have maximum photosynthesis, therefore you have maximum yields. It's one of the highest yielding oilseed crops in the world, and that is why it is expanding so rapidly. That's what makes palm oil so popular, and that's also what makes it relatively cheap within the vegetable oil sector. However, as a refined fuel, yes, as I said, fossil fuels are still more expensive. Yeah. Sorry, no, they're not. I said it completely wrong. Yeah, so HVO palm oil is still more expensive than the fossil fuel jet fuel. Sorry. Next question. Is there any list of the most likely countries that will supply the palm oil and the countries most likely to purchase biofuels for planes? Most likely suppliers, well, about at least 80% of palm oil production in the world is currently in Indonesia and Malaysia combined. Indonesia happens to be the only country so far that has set a mandatory target or quota for aviation biofuels, 2% to come in from next year. Whether that'll actually be met or not remains to be seen, but they certainly have a lot of interest in that. Worldwide, however, palm oil production is expanding rapidly in, you know, many other tropical countries, from the Philippines to Nigeria, Cameroon, to Brazil, to Mexico, and you know, Peru, and many other places as well. Which countries will buy them? Well, at the moment, there are really very few subsidies in place for aviation biofuels. There is, in the moment, airlines are not yet using them on a large scale, and they're not sourcing palm oil for the tiny amount that they're purchasing right now. So everything will depend on policies and subsidies, potential subsidies and policies put in place or not put in place. Yeah, I would need to speculate about what the outcome would be. Our concern is to raise awareness and hope that policymakers will be very, very cautious and not trigger the expansion of this market. If vegetable oil is more expensive than fossil fuels, why would anyone use them? Well, as I tried to explain, the whole, I mean, right now, so that's biofuel, should basically be biofuels compared to fossil fuels. Yeah, I mean, the whole issue is that there is this huge pressure on the industry and on ICAO for the industry to be seen as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, bioenergy is in international accounting terms, the carbon dioxide emissions that come from burning biofuels are ignored, so it's treated as zero carbon. Therefore, it's a way for, biofuel use is a way for industry to, on paper, be seen as reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. It comes down to what's been widely criticized by scientists as a major accounting error. but it's basically the idea is that you can keep the industry's interest is simply to keep up their growth and be seen to on paper to reduce their emissions. That's what's driving it. And that's why there is this big call for subsidies, including targets and mandates being put in place. Okay, another one. Why focus on HVO? If lowest impact biofuel is made economically feasible, it will still have a big impact, right? Yeah, I mean, the focus is on HVO because it's the only current state of technology, it's the only type of aviation fuel that could be produced on a significant scale. There's nothing else there. No, the lower, yes, I think it is absolutely right that I mean, I totally agree that if there was a way to make large scale biofuels produced from wood or from sugarcane or from other types of technically feasible, or if you could the lower cost produced biofuels from soybean oil or from rapeseed oil, you would still have massive land use, and you would still have massive negative impacts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from land use, on biodiversity, on forests, and on communities. You'd still have knock-on effects in terms of land grabbing if other feedstocks were used. It's just that that's not really on the horizon at the moment, as far as I can see. Palm oil is really, really central to this particular debate. But yeah, it's a good point. Aviation biofuels wouldn't be green or low carbon or acceptable if they didn't depend on palm oil. It's definitely not so. That's important to point out. Thanks. Things. I'm not sure. So some question: if things run like here in the it may not catch. We have fuel biofuel percentage. People don't use it so much. I'm not sure. The big question is whether ICAO will, I put policies in place. Member states will put policies in place that will get airlines to use, will either oblige airlines to blend a mandatory level of biofuels, or that will strongly incentivize them. Yeah, that's the whole question. Is this going to happen? Will those policies be put in place or not? And we hope they won't be. But at the same time, as I say, we also hope that instead of putting those policies in place, that we see the sensible alternatives of actually tackling the growth in aviation and curbing and reversing that. Oh, one point made here. I think there's potential for us to reveal that it is greenwash. Yes. Yes, it should really be exposed, and that's what we are hoping to do in this report and webinar. But yeah, the more groups are happy to have exposed that'd be really, really important, really positive. So there don't seem to be any more questions. However, you've got our email address. So if anything does come to mind that you want to discuss and you want to check, please do. You can email us, and we'll be getting back to you next week. If next week with any more information. But you might also find the answers in the report.
Great, thank you very much, Almuth. So we're going to end our broadcast there. Thanks very much to everyone who participated. The video of the presentation and the audio and the questions will be available at the same link online afterwards if you want to watch it again or send it to friends and colleagues. So thank you very much, everybody.